Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg of the Remnant podcast. I thought I was out, but Adam dragged me back in. I had a brief riff on the normal ruminant, which, one would think would be enough. But Adam convinced me that I should revise and expand on my disagreements. And I think they're like legitimate disagreements. I don't, unlike a lot of people who call themselves part of the new right, I think there's a there to Chris Rufo. But Chris Rufo, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal about how I think the headline was meet the new right's meet the new right's favorite communist. So it's about meet MAGA's favorite communist was what it was called, and it's all about how the new right, which is a contested and complicated term for reasons I'm not going to get deep in the weeds on here, but how the new right really loves this Italian Marxist intellectual, Antonio Gramsci. And I will admit, Gramsci's an interesting dude. If you go back through the pages of, how to put this? Okay, so Gramsci is wildly associated with this phrase or thought about the quote unquote long march through the institutions. And that's often sort of used as a shorthand or a summary of Gramscian thought. And it's basically this idea that the new left or the Marxists, it depends because it keeps coming up in different places at different times, but the left undertook this long march, right? This takeover of the institutions. Usually this is mostly about universities, but sometimes it's also about Hollywood or whatever. One of the weird, quirky ironies about all of this is that Gramsci never actually used the phrase march through the institutions. That actually came from a guy named Rudi Dutschke, a German socialist dude from the 1970s who talked about why he was going to join the government so he could kind of like become an activist from within and change things from within and move. He didn't use the phrase Overton window, but move the Overton window and use power from within the establishment, from within elite institutions, along Marxist or quasi-Marxist lines, whatever. And the irony isn't just that Gramsci never said long march through the institutions, even though that phrase is always associated with Gramsci. There's pretty much no evidence that Dutschke had Gramsci in mind when he said it or when he made the argument. The long march he was referring to was the Maoist long march, which led to the takeover of China, which I just don't think is an auspicious origin story for a concept that conservatives want to embrace. But anyway, this phrase, the long march through the institutions, not Gramsci's, but it's Gramscian idea. He talked about, cultural hegemony and these various things and power disposition or whatever, all these buzz phrases. And basically it's the same idea insofar as Gramsci was a fan of Mussolini. See, I know some of this stuff because I spent so long working on liberal fascism and Gramsci was one of these communist intellectuals who had a theory of where fascism was. He actually had two theories of fascism or two kinds of fascism, but actually there were more than that from Gramsci. But basically but for Mussolini, no one would have ever heard of Gramsci. That may be a little unfair, but he would not be the figure that he is because Gramsci, like a lot of socialists and pretty much all of the socialists in Italy, prior to World War I, was a big fan of Mussolini's. And because Mussolini was one of, if not the leader of Italian socialists prior to World War I. And in fact, that title, Il Duce, which means the leader, it's like the Italian version of the Führer. Mussolini was first called Il Duce when he was the leader of the Italian socialists. I think it was like after he got out of jail for one of the many times he was sent to jail. He came out and he was hailed as Il Duce of the socialists. Anyway, a lot of communists broke with Mussolini, or when Mussolini broke with them, Um, a lot of it had to do with Mussolini's decision that Italy should, in fact, first he was like for armed neutrality, and then eventually he was for getting into World War One. And this was the great betrayal in all sorts of countries throughout Europe about how the socialists were supposed to stay out of the war, and internet, workers of the world unite, and all this kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden, like in Germany, the socialists voted for the war credits and all this kind of thing, and you get all this sort of the great schisms of socialism in the early 20th century stem from this period. And so Mussolini basically becomes the founder of fascism, and eventually, after his march on Rome, um, becomes the dictator of Italy. And Gramsci was one of his biggest critics in the early days in the early 1920s in Italy. And he was also utterly loyal to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was essentially their man in Italy, him and some other people, but he was like, there was this other guy, I can't remember his name, Tagliano or something like that. And the two of them were basically the Mutt and Jeff of the Soviet Union in fascist Italy, of the Stalinists. And but he was a really smart guy, kind of brilliant. He was actually originally from Sardinia, I think. And he was a really biting and sometimes really amusing critic of Mussolini. And so as Mussolini is consolidating power, he's like, this guy's got to go. And so they threw him in prison. Um, the prosecutor it was essentially a show trial. The prosecutor said, we have to stop this man's brain from functioning for the next 20 years or something like that, some famous line. And so Gramsci goes to prison, and um, if you're a smart, energetic Marxist intellectual, prison was kind of awesome in fascist Italy. That's unfair, right? I mean, he eventually died because his health got so bad in prison and all the rest. But he became basically a professor and a theoretician in prison. He wrote his most influential thing were these notes from prison, or his prison notes, whatever they're called, which are kind of like this scattershot collection of his writings and observations and stuff. And while in prison, he starts formulating these ideas about where fascism came from. And a lot of it is warmed over Marxist stuff about, how the bourgeoisie joined forces with the industrial ruling classes um, as forces of reaction to break up um, the March of Progress by the working man, all of that kind of stuff. There are nuances. There's so many friggin' nuances among all of these guys writing in that period. But his whole theory about why fascism took hold and consolidated had to do with this argument about hegemony and power among intellectuals. And he kind of vanished from the scene as an important intellectual. He died. He got so sick, I think in 1935. You'd correct me on all these dates. I mean, I'm doing a G file thing where I'll get into some of this and I'll get the dates right and all that. But I'm basically a Dom servant here. He gets so sick, he's released from prison in 35 and dies by like 37. And one of the ironies is that some of the stuff that he wrote about, and some of his theories, if he had not been in prison, he wouldn't have been allowed to write that stuff because he would have been considered a deviationist of some kind. He didn't put enough emphasis on the role of, the Hegelian dialectic and the role of force and industrialization, or whatever Stalin wanted you to believe at any given moment. And so he got to be more creative, and he had developed this theory about how fascism arose from the role of sort of legitimizing intellectuals in the bourgeois class who sided with fascism. And this became later. So basically he just goes to ground. I mean, he sort of becomes a footnote for a long time. And then in the 1970s, and into the 1980s, his stuff is translated, it's rediscovered. He basically becomes like, he and Foucault are like the major intellectual um, uh, it boys of, the major intellectual lodestars um, of the left in the 1970s and 80s. And for Gramsci, more so in Europe, Foucault more so in the United States. Foucault's theories about the relationship of power and all this kind of stuff. There's some overlap with Gramsci in a certain way, but Gramsci basically becomes the inspiration for Euro communism. The hard left movements inside of Europe in the 70s and 80s. Sometimes they were actually just called the New Gramscians. There was talk of a Gramsci boom. He just became, cool. And so anyway, the argument is basically that, and so one of the arguments for why, or one of the explanations for why Gramsci was so popular with intellectuals in the 70s and 80s is that Gramsci elevated the importance of intellectuals and academics in his theory about how power is wielded. And this was exciting and um, and complemented the egos of radical disaffected Marxists in academia who liked the idea of being able to, first of all, like the idea that they mattered, and like the idea that their radical disenchantment with the decadent bourgeois liberal or neoliberal order was advancing the cause of communism, in its new sort of post doctrinaire Marxist form, or to that effect. And so eventually this boomlet for Gramsci in Europe, like all of these bad ideas, comes to the United States. And the um, the new left liked this argument. It ratified the same desire for relevance among, Marxist or quasi-Marxist or fellow traveling Marxist radical intellectuals in the West. You really matter, all that kind of stuff. You're good enough, you're smart enough, and doggone it, people like you, or at least history really likes you. And as often happens, the right noticed what the left was into. And so, like, if you go through the pages of National Review, I haven't done this, but I'm sure of it, you will find lots of references to the Gramscian long march through the institutions, right? And again, it's this argument that, sort of borrowing from Lenin, which, Gramsci obviously did, about controlling the commanding heights of the culture. And that by fostering a sense of consensus among elites, they are able to shape discourse, right? So this is where it overlaps a lot with the Foucault stuff, um, and constrain. What is the Chomsky thing? Managed dissent, or whatever it was. It's these ideas that somehow the elites can shape what is considered permissible to talk about and not talk about, and move society in a given direction. And it has a nice kind of conspiratorial kind of frisson to it. I've used the phrase and written about it a lot. And so have just countless other people. I think the first time I ever heard the phrase, and it stuck, was a piece by Andy Ferguson for the Weekly Standard about higher education and what a scandal at Hillsdale sort of said about, conservative institutions that were created to combat, or recreated in the case of Hillsdale, to combat the success of the left's march through the institutions and all that. But anyway, it's sort of like, a lot of conservatives, including me, I'm guilty of all of this. And there's nothing wrong with it. I'll get to that in a second. But a lot of conservatives pick up on hot ideas among the left and incorporate them into their analysis, right? We actually pay the left the compliment of taking their ideas seriously. And so that's why countless conservatives, talk about cultural Marxism, right? And the Frankfurt School and all of that. I've written a lot about the Frankfurt School. That's these guys like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, who also make very similar arguments to Gramsci about, this stuff, about how there's this sort of hidden behind the obvious, there is this way of sort of trying to shape people and herd people into thinking a certain way. If you've ever read my stuff about the movie They Live and how all of these Frankfurt School Marxists love that movie because of its deeply Marxist, allegedly intentional, but not. But it's considered one of the great Marxist allegories by a whole bunch of crazy left-wing philosophers and stuff. And so right-wingers have talked about this for a long time, and I don't think there's anything to apologize for, because there's a grain of truth to it. There's more than a grain of truth to it. It is true. I mean, how many times have I said, it's probably on the Remnant bingo card, that the left controls the commanding heights of the culture. They Hollywood, publishing, journalism, obviously academia, all the rest, right? And and it plays into all these arguments about how to should conservatives create their own new universities and media platforms, or and just abandon the traditional and mainstream media and traditional institutions, or should they try to recapture these things? And I have been consistent on this for 30 plus years about how it would be much better to have more conservatives at Harvard than a dozen more Hillsdales, even though Hillsdale does a lot of great stuff. It's just that you can't have new old institutions. These are our institutions too. They're American institutions. And it is a disservice to everybody to have them be ideologically homogenous and plagued with groupthink. And so anyway, the argument that Chris Rufo and a bunch of other people have bought into is that the left won by following Gramsci's advice about seizing control of the commanding heights, having this long march through the institutions, and they understand power and how to use it. And so we, and I say we with air quotes around it, because this is like, now this is one of these defining things for certain factions of the new right. And again, I got to get to the new right in a second. But for the Rufo faction, they're going to use the power of government and politics and media in an aggressive and forceful and Gramscian manly way to force changes and move the Overton window and force consensus on right of center terms in all sorts of ways, and yada, 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 yada. And, to a certain extent, I wish them luck. My problem with all of this, what set this off was that I hadn't seen the journal piece. I saw Rufo tweeted. So he tweeted the article out, and it said, and then he declared, the right is learning new political tactics. We are not going to indulge the fantasies of the quote unquote classical liberals who forfeited all of the institutions. We're going to fight tooth and nail to recapture the regime and entrench our ideas in the public sphere. Get ready. Yeah, okay, whatever. So I objected to this, and I asked, my tweet said, a lot of the ideas of the right are classically liberal, or at the very least they were considered to be so for a century or so. Could you explicate which classically liberal ideas you think are fantasies? Because I could swear a lot of your Manhattan Institute colleagues don't think they're fantastical. And then we got into this exchange, and and I want to thank him. It was fairly thoughtful, and polite, and all of that. And he threw a lot of references to James Burnham and more, Gramsci at me, and the Machiavellians. Burnham had written this book called The Machiavellians. I have it right over there. I was looking at it after this whole exchange, which is more about Italian elite theorists like Mosca, Pareto's, and Michel's, who are not in the same group as Gramsci. And it's a little weird how he hasn't explicitly lumped them in the same group, but they're not in the same group. At least not by my lights. And so here's my basic problem is that, well, there are a bunch of different problems, but to start with, I'm not accusing Rufo of being illiberal or being authoritarian, or any of that stuff, but he is decidedly celebratory of all of the things, or at least seems to be. Again, I'm not the closest student of of Rufo's stuff, but he is celebratory of the sea change that we're seeing in the Trump era. Does not seem to be all that perturbed by the use of blunt force by the Trump administration against Harvard and all these other institutions. I don't know if he said anything about what the Trump administration is doing with law firms, but I find that indefensible and repugnant. Not Rufo's silence on it necessarily, just what Trump is doing to those law firms. It's a way, as David French says, of hacking the Constitution in, I think, utterly impermissible ways, or what should be impermissible ways. But anyway, I feel like I've seen this before, right? I've been talking about this for a long time about how, another one of these lefties that the right got kind of fixated with in the last 20 years was Saul Alinsky. And, he's the guy who wrote Rules for Radicals. And particularly in the early Obama, the early Obama, the late Bush administration to the early Obama administration, the fact that Obama was a community organizer and quote unquote studied Alinsky's methods, and Alinsky was the most famous community organizer, and Hillary Clinton wrote a senior thesis on Alinsky and quoted her in her graduation speech from college. I made a big deal about this stuff and liberal fascism. I don't like Saul Alinsky. I don't like his tactics. I don't like his methods. And I used to be sort of credited with one of the people to put Alinsky on the radar with the right. I kind of regret it now, because what happened over time was that the right, a lot of people on the right, Dinesh D'Souza comes most to mind, but also people like Steve Bannon, they went from saying, here's this bad guy that the left uses, whose tactics the left uses to win, to saying, oh my gosh, the left always wins, and therefore we have to use his tactics and we have to be right-wing Alinskyites. I don't want to be right-wing Alinskyites. I don't want to emulate the guy who, in his acknowledgments, name checks Lucifer. And I feel like the same thing is going on with this Gramsci stuff, is that this effort to use Gramscian tactics, or alleged Gramscian tactics. Again, Gramsci didn't use any of these tactics. He spent most of his adult life, in prison for criticizing Mussolini, and then was released and died shortly thereafter. So like, this idea that Gramsci had any success with his own tactics is just fanciful and made up. It's also just not true that the Euro communists had a lot of success with Gramsci. So I don't know what people are talking about necessarily, about all of these people who explicitly embrace Gramsci's tactics to gain power are, what they're referring to. It is true that the left, took over a lot of institutions. And I think that has been bad for the left and bad for America. How many of them were explicitly Gramscian? I don't know. I think probably more of them were Foucauldian. I think more of them were just new left jerks who didn't want to hear from moderates and traditional liberals and classical liberals, and never mind conservatives, and they closed ranks and pulled up the gangplank to the institutions that they took over. And shame on them for it. But this idea that the secret to gaining power is to follow Gramsci, the historical record is just not really strong on that. And it also implies that there was this coordinated conspiracy to do it, which I just think is kind of ahistorical. But it's also just worth keeping in mind that, Gramsci was just a full-on Marxist and communist, both little c and big C, right? He was a member of the Communist Party. He was loyal to Moscow. And he was a doctrinaire, communist who got a little more creative in his downtime in prison. But his theory about where fascism came from is wrong. His theory about how liberalism was going to be replaced in dialectical or some other fashion by true communism was wrong. The Marxists were wrong because Marx was wrong. Marx was wrong about all sorts of stuff. And but the thing that, getting back to my point about Alinsky, the thing that really troubles me about this is I've seen people argue for using illiberal means as a way to achieve liberal ends, right? Or just to use bad means, evil means, undesirable means to achieve good ends. That's where we get this cliche about the ends don't justify the means, which is a very, very old idea. And to Rufo's credit, he acknowledges that he's a Machiavellian. He says he's a Machiavellian. And he both in terms of like actually Machiavelli, but also like these Italian theorists that Burnham called Machiavellian. And I take him at his word that he does not want to be an illiberal person and create illiberal institutions and all of that. I don't trust. I'm not saying I don't trust him. I don't trust his ability to maintain discipline on an inchoate movement that is just celebrating at almost every turn the raw use and abuse of power to achieve their ends. So it is not like Donald Trump is going to be amenable to an argument from Rufo saying, "Hey, look, you did a great job smashing down these walls, but now what we have to get into the rebuilding of more healthy liberal institutions." Steve Bannon, who followed this Alinskyite crap, he was, he was perverted and consumed by this end, the means justifying the end stuff, to the point where he's all about the means, right? I mean, it's not just the cruelty is the point crowd. Bannon explicitly calls himself a Leninist. And the problem I have with all of this is that if you want to do hardball politics in order to, restore and revive liberal institutions, that's great. He says, Rufo says something about how he's much more interested in republicanism, small r republicanism, a topic we have talked about a great deal on this podcast. I love small r republicanism, depending on how you define it. And that's one of the problems about how to define it. But a good sort of shorthand for a healthy form of republicanism is that institutions and leaders need to see the big picture about how to maintain and pass on a healthy liberal society, right? It is about, the small r Republican stuff is all about leadership, statesmanship, responsibility. What is my role here? What is for the greater good? How do we maintain a free society? How do we maintain virtue? All of these sorts of things, and understanding that there are tensions between these competing desires. And I just don't see a lot of small r Republicans in the new right now. Most of them, I mean, Kurt Schlichter and that crowd, they talk as if we are just simply at war and that other Americans are a demonic enemy. There's all this sort of, crazy dehumanization of people that, the new right disagrees with. And in pursuit of, by using illiberal means, and like, again, we'll just absolve Rufo, who denies the charge that he's going to use illiberal means, but the broader new right loves illiberal means. I mean, we've just spent this last week with JD Vance just mocking people who think that due process is a thing this administration accuses people of being. His position is, if this administration feels justified in accusing someone of being a domestic terrorist, or member of a drug cartel, or just an illegal immigrant, then that's all that is required, and that due process and habeas corpus and all that stuff should have no role in it. That's illiberal. That's anti-constitutional. Telling law firms that you don't like, for sometimes really bizarre reasons, pretextual reasons, that they're going to lose all the security clearances. Okay, you have the power to do that. That you're not going to be a client of the government. Okay, you have the power to do that. But telling lawyers that they can't enter government run buildings, government owned buildings, you're basically saying that, a lawyer can't enter a courthouse can't visit a client, can't do depositions when it's, contesting possibly unconstitutional or illegal things. You're basically just trying to destroy the ability to get counsel for your political enemies. Trump has issued, essentially bills of attainder, signaling out people and designating them as sort of criminal unpersons. This is the stuff that's getting cheers. And, and forget all the Doge stuff or, all of the, craziness with NIH. These are not thoughtful Republican, these are not thoughtful attempts to get better governance and create more Republican institutions. This is a lot of just sort of retribution and political, oppression of enemies. And that's the side that is celebrating this new Gramscian turn. And again, I just, you can't celebrate a Marxist, anti-liberal communist and say he has this sort of Gnostic insight into how power really works without that sort of getting into, that those toxins can get through your skin. And I don't see why, when I didn't like New Left people lionizing communists and illiberal Marxists, post-liberal Marxists, right? Why that critique completely vanishes simply because someone's doing it allegedly for my team. And just there was one last point, right? So like I absolutely agree that the left got control of a lot of these elite institutions, a lot of these universities, a lot of these faculties, and that's bad. Same thing with a lot of these foundations and stuff. But there is this fundamental disconnect between the analysis of a lot of these, do you know what time it is, new right people, and how we have to do what the left did and emulate people like Gramsci and Alinsky because they won every fight and they have all of this power. And the fact that the same new right people, again, I don't know about Rufo in particular, but a lot of the same new right people, they're also bitching and moaning about the power of libertarians and how neoliberalism has complete hegemony over the political economy of the West. You can't have it both ways. All of those sort of, new left Prius driving, Marxists, they didn't like neoliberalism. They don't like free markets. They don't like free trade. They've been talking about degrowth and the limits to growth, going back to the Club of Rome, right? And all that kind of stuff. At the height of the Gramscian moment of the 1970s, they were all talking about how capitalism was, destroying the world because of overpopulation. And Paul Ehrlich was right. And we're going to have this neo-Malthusian crisis because capitalism could not feed people and all these kinds of things. And in the 80s and 90s, you had all these, Naomi Klein types talking about how neoliberalism was destroying the world. And, all of the Marxists on these little islands of college campuses were dismayed about the turn that Reagan was taking the country. And if that's the case, tell me again about how all of these tweety tenured radicals have all of this power to control society and, constrain consensus on Marxian terms. Like maybe the hegemony of the Marxian classes and the Marxian intellectuals didn't extend that much farther than the reserved parking spots at Yale or Brown. Or maybe the just simple fact is that the whole Marxian prism that people on the new left and the new right bring to analysis is just wrong. It just doesn't actually. So like, this is Rufo's big thing about taking politics seriously and how the founders were much more Machiavellian. Well, I'd like to see some of his better, more drawn out examples of what he means by how the founders were Machiavellian. I'm sure Adams and some of these guys read Machiavelli. They were very smart dudes, and Machiavelli had interesting things to say. But it's also just worth pointing out that the tactics of revolutionaries and people creating a government and fighting for independence are going to be different than the ideas that you do use to keep a republic, as Ben Franklin said. They're kind of different things. At some point, you put away the guns and you create a liberal order, a constitutional order of checks and balances, of free speech, of freedom of association, of free markets, and you let it work its magic. And the similarities between the sort of old new left and the new right on this stuff is really remarkable, because basically it strikes me mostly as just a form of power worship. And, we need these good jobs and we need these good titles and we need these good sinecures, and we've been frozen out and we're resentful. I mean, resentment from people like Michael Anton and who wrote the Flight 93 election stuff explains a hell of a lot more than any clever ideas about Red Caesar and, and all of that. These guys, they're pissed off, and I don't blame them for being pissed off that a bunch of mediocrities took over a bunch of institutions with bad ideas. But the way you beat bad ideas is with good ideas. And it gets easier and easier to beat bad ideas with good ideas as the people with bad ideas get a chance to work with them, and they turn out to be bad ideas. The reason why Marxism did not take over in the West was because it didn't work. And that made it really easy to fight against over the long haul, because it didn't work. And if these Marxists had the cultural and intellectual and cultural hegemony that all these people claim, it wouldn't have mattered. And Western Europe and America would have become North Korea, where anytime someone tried to reform or fix things popped up, the people with all of the power would have sent them, to prison. I mean, if America was the kind of society that requires a Gramsci, then Chris Rufo would be writing this stuff from his prison cell. But there's so much cosplay out there about the kind of authoritarian hellscape that we live in the United States of America, because Joe friggin' Biden was president, or that Barack Obama was president, that it gives permission to do all sorts of things that are illiberal, that are disdainful of the rule of law and the constitutional order. And it doesn't mean everybody on that side of things is wrong about everything, but the Popular Front attitude that says the only enemies are to the left, and that everything that the right is doing is towards some sort of greater good, I just don't trust them. I'm totally in favor of people doing what they can to like make better institutions that that teach and enshrine the principles of classical liberalism. But I just don't think making an obscure communist political prisoner into your dashboard saint for how you do that is all that well advised. And when you start playing with those ideas start playing with you. And I just see evidence for that all over the place. And so, again, I wish Rufo luck. I'll be interested when his book comes out. I'm wildly unpersuaded by the idea that Gramsci is the blueprint for how to, restore America and make it great again, or anything like that. I think Gramsci is the blueprint for an argument for how a bunch of activists can raise money and get attention, and conceivably, supplant the old right, the old Reaganite right with this populist new right. And just the last thing about the new right, there've been a lot of new rights. And I think there are a lot of different factions of the new right now. I'm confident Rufo is not an anti-Semite or anything like that. There are a lot of anti-Semites on what is called the new right. There are a lot of people I would argue are racist on the new right. There are a lot of bad people on the new that fly under the flag of the new right. I don't think that's Rufo's flag. But if you want to persuade people that it's not your flag, you got to pick a lot of fights on your own side to provide clarity about that. Otherwise, it is perfectly reasonable to assume that this popular front is something that everybody is happy to be part of. And, this is one of the reasons why the left got itself into trouble, is they didn't do enough policing of their own side. And so the people with the craziest ideas were seen as um, part of the great coalition of the righteous. And it allowed people like Donald Trump to get elected, which again would have been impossible if the left had the kind of cultural hegemony that all of these guys claim it has. Your enemies are not demonic and they are not all powerful. And the right hasn't always lost and the left hasn't always won. But if you convince yourself of that, you give yourself all sorts of permission to do a lot of stupid and terrible things under the rubric of, do you know what time it is? And I think Rufo is trying to do this in a more responsible and thoughtful way. I am not persuaded by it, but I don't think this tendency to sort of lend aid and comfort or provide silence about the horrible stuff going on your side of the aisle while inflating the evils of the other side is a recipe for more normal times or a more healthy liberal republic. So anyway, there I am. I went too long, but I blame Adam and he will edit this as he sees fit.